The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as the judge's gavel struck the wooden block. All eyes turned to the man sitting at the defense table, former officer Richard Hale. His face was pale, his once confident demeanor replaced by a blank stare. The judge's voice was firm, cutting through the silence like a blade. 15 years in federal prison, he declared, his words echoing through the room. Gasps rippled across the gallery, and murmurs of mixed emotions filled the air. On one side of the room, supporters of justice, including members of the late Lieutenant Colonel Denise Caldwell's family, clung to one another, tears streaming down their faces. On the other, Hale's sparse supporters sat frozen, disbelief etched across their features. Hale's eyes darted around the room, seeking sympathy but finding none. The weight of his actions and the life he had unjustly taken had finally caught up with him. The image of Denise Caldwell, a decorated Army officer and mother of two, haunted everyone in that courtroom. But it wasn't just the sentence that sent shockwaves through the room. It was the reason why Hale had acted the way he did. Denise Caldwell wasn't just another victim of police brutality. She was a hero, a woman who gave her life trying to save a child. And Hale, blinded by prejudice and arrogance, had pulled the trigger without hesitation. The judge's gavel struck again, signaling the end of the hearing, but it left everyone on edge. The question lingering in the room was unspoken, yet loud. How did it come to this? How did a respected Army colonel end up gunned down in broad daylight by a man who was supposed to protect and serve? The day of the tragedy had started like any other for Denise. It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She was off duty, wearing casual clothes, enjoying the kind of peace that came rarely in her line of work. She strolled down the sidewalk. She noticed a group of children playing in a nearby park. Their laughter filled the air, and Denise smiled. That's when she noticed a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, chasing a ball that had rolled into the street. The ball bounced once, then twice, landing in the middle of the road. The boy darted after it, completely unaware of the oncoming car speeding toward him. Denise didn't think twice. Her instincts kicked in as years of military training took over. She sprinted toward the boy, shouting for him to stop. Time seemed to slow as the car hurtled closer. With one final burst of energy, Denise dove, pushing the boy out of harm's way. He landed safely on the grass, clutching his ball with wide, terrified eyes. But Denise wasn't so lucky. The car screeched to a halt, missing her by inches, but the driver's angry shouting drowned out any relief she might have felt. Before she could catch her breath, another sound cut through the chaos, a sharp, loud command. "Stop right there." Denise looked up to see Officer Richard Hale, his hand already on his gun. His face was set in a scowl, his eyes cold and unyielding. She raised her hands slowly, trying to explain what had happened. "Don't move," Hale barked, his voice harsh and accusatory. To him, Denise wasn't a hero. She wasn't even a person. All he saw was a black woman in a situation he didn't care to understand. The crowd of onlookers tried to intervene, shouting that Denise had saved the boy's life, but Hale ignored them. His gun was already drawn, his mind made up. And then it happened. A single shot rang out, silencing the shouts and cries. Denise crumpled to the ground, clutching her side as blood seeped through her shirt. The boy she had just saved ran to her, tears streaming down his face, while the crowd erupted in panic. Hale stood frozen, his gun still in his hand. The reality of what he had done began to set in, but by then, it was too late. As the courtroom emptied, Denise's family lingered, holding on to one another for support. The verdict had brought some measure of justice, but it couldn't bring Denise back. Outside, a crowd of supporters cheered, their voices rising in unity against the systemic racism that had claimed yet another innocent life. Hale was led away in handcuffs, his once proud uniform now a stark reminder of the abuse of power that had led to this moment. But even as the prison doors awaited him, the fight for justice was far from over. This was only the beginning. The events leading up to that tragic day began to unravel in the weeks that followed, painting a clearer picture of how an ordinary moment had turned into a horrifying tragedy. The world now knew Denise Caldwell as a hero who sacrificed herself to save a child, but few understood the deeper complexities that led to Officer Richard Hale pulling the trigger that day. Denise was no stranger to danger. As an Army colonel, she had served multiple tours overseas, earning accolades for her leadership and courage under fire. Her peers respected her, her community adored her, and her two children, Jasmine and Daniel, saw her as their greatest role model. Despite the challenges of military life, Denise had always found time for her family, instilling in them values of kindness, strength, and integrity. The day of the incident, Denise had decided to take a much-needed break from her demanding schedule. She had planned to meet an old friend for lunch at a cafe near the park. On her way, she noticed the children playing a simple scene of innocence and joy. But it was that small decision to pause and watch them that would change everything. At the same time, Officer Hale was patrolling the area. Known among his peers for his abrasive demeanor, Hale had a reputation for targeting minorities under the guise of doing his job. That day, his frustration was already simmering, fueled by an earlier confrontation with a fellow officer who had questioned his aggressive tactics. For Hale, every situation was black and white, and his narrow worldview often blinded him to the humanity of those he encountered. As Denise approached the scene, the children's ball escaped onto the road. She saw the little boy dart after it, oblivious to the danger speeding toward him. Her instincts as a soldier and a mother took over. She didn't hesitate for a second. Pushing past fear, she ran toward the child, shouting a warning as the car approached. Witnesses later described the moment as both heroic and terrifying. The crowd had watched in awe as Denise threw herself into the street, saving the boy in the nick of time. But relief quickly turned to confusion as Officer Hale arrived, his hand already on his weapon. "Ma'am, step away from the child," Hale had commanded, his voice filled with authority, but laced with unwarranted suspicion. Denise, still catching her breath, turned to face him, her hands raised. "I just saved him," she explained calmly, her military training evident in her composed demeanor. But Hale's eyes narrowed, his mind racing with assumptions. He didn't see the decorated officer who had risked her life for a child. He saw a black woman in casual clothes standing in the middle of the street, and his biases filled in the rest. The crowd tried to interject, shouting that Denise was a hero. The boy's mother ran forward, screaming, "She saved my son!" But Hale ignored them, his focus solely on Denise. To him, she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. "Put your hands where I can see them," Hale barked, his gun now fully drawn. Denise's heart pounded, but she didn't waver. She had faced far worse in combat zones. But this was different. This was her own country, the one she had sworn to protect, turning against her. She tried again to explain, her voice steady but urgent. "Officer, you've got it all wrong. I'm not a threat. The crowd's shouts grew louder, their voices mixing into a cacophony of panic and disbelief. Hale's hand tightened on his gun, his judgment clouded by fear and prejudice. And then, with a single pull of the trigger, he ended Denise Caldwell's life. The silence that followed was deafening. The boy Denise had saved clung to her, crying uncontrollably as his mother screamed for help. The bystanders, many of them filming the encounter on their phones, stared in shock at the scene unfolding before them. Hale stood frozen, his gun still smoking. For a brief moment, he seemed to realize the gravity of his actions. But instead of stepping back, he doubled down, ordering the horrified onlookers to stay back and claiming that he had feared for his life. The crowd erupted, their anger boiling over. "She saved the kid," one man shouted, pointing at the boy, who was now being cradled by his sobbing mother. "You shot a hero." But Hale's mind was already spinning, trying to justify what he had done. He ignored the protests and radioed for backup, his voice steady but cold. To him, the situation was under control. He didn't yet understand the storm he had unleashed. Back in the courtroom, Denise's children sat in the front row, clutching each other's hands as they listened to the verdict. Jasmine, the eldest, stared at Hale as he was led away in handcuffs. Her mother's death had left a hole in her heart, but she refused to let it break her. As the crowd began to disperse, Jasmine turned to her brother and whispered, "Mom always said we have to fight for what's right. This isn't over." And she was right. The fight for justice was just beginning. Follow, like, and share for more stories that shine a light on courage, injustice, and the power of standing up for what is right. The courtroom might have settled into silence after the sentencing, but outside, the story was far from over. The world buzzed with Denise Caldwell's name. Social media platforms were flooded with videos of the incident, eyewitness accounts, and heartfelt tributes to the fallen hero. Justice for Denise became a rallying cry, uniting people across the country who demanded accountability and systemic change. Jasmine and Daniel, still reeling from their mother's death, found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't asked for, but one they knew Denise would have fought for herself. As they navigated their grief, they decided to honor their mother's memory by turning their pain into purpose. The night after the trial, Jasmine sat at the dining table, surrounded by piles of handwritten letters from strangers. People from every corner of the country sent their condolences, sharing how Denise's story had inspired them. One letter stood out, a note from a fellow Army officer who had served under Denise during a dangerous mission in Afghanistan. "She saved my life," the letter read. Denise Caldwell was the kind of leader who believed no one was ever too far gone to be helped. She stood for something greater than herself. Let her story do the same. Jasmine clutched the letter, her heart heavy but determined. She looked at Daniel, who was staring blankly at a photo of their mother in uniform. "We need to do something," she said firmly. "Mom wouldn't want this to just fade away." Daniel looked up, his eyes red from crying. "What can we even do? The cop's in jail, but that doesn't change anything. It won't bring her back." Jasmine leaned forward, her voice steady but passionate. "No, it won't. But it can stop this from happening again. We can make sure no one forgets who Mom was and what she stood for." Meanwhile, the backlash against Officer Hale continued to grow. His conviction had been a small victory, but many argued that 15 years was far too lenient for such a horrific crime. Protesters gathered outside police stations, holding signs that read, "15 years for a life." And accountability is not enough. We need change. The police department released a statement condemning Hale's actions and promising reform, but it rang hollow to many. Activists pointed out that Hale's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger problem within the system. One of the protest leaders, a young woman named Maya Hernandez, reached out to Jasmine after seeing her speak at a memorial for Denise. Maya was fiery, determined, and unafraid to call out injustice, but she also carried a deep respect for Jasmine's quiet strength. "I know you didn't ask for this," Maya said during their first meeting, "but your voice carries weight. People listen when you talk about your mom. If you're willing, we could use your help." Jasmine hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step into the spotlight, but then she thought about her mother. Denise had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was. "What do you need me to do?" Jasmine finally asked, her voice resolute. As Jasmine and Maya began organizing rallies and speaking at events, more details about Hale's past came to light. Investigative journalists uncovered a pattern of complaints against him, allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and harassment. Despite this, he had been allowed to stay on the force, shielded by a system that prioritized protecting its own over holding officers accountable. The revelations sparked even more outrage. News outlets aired interviews with former colleagues of Hale, some of whom admitted they had been afraid to report him due to fear of retaliation. The system wasn't just broken, it was actively enabling dangerous behavior. Jasmine couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and frustration as she watched the reports. How many lives could have been saved if they'd just done something sooner, she said to Daniel one evening. Daniel, who had been quietly working on a scrapbook of their mother's achievements, looked up and said, "It doesn't matter how long it takes, Jazz. What matters is that we don't stop fighting." One evening, while preparing for a rally, Jasmine received a call from the mother of the boy Denise had saved. Her name was Maria, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I've been meaning to reach out," Maria said. I didn't know what to say. Your mom saved my son's life. She didn't even know him, but she didn't hesitate. I owe her everything." Jasmine felt tears welling up as Maria continued. "I want to help in any way I can. People need to know who she was and what she stood for. Her story has to mean something." Mariah's words solidified Jasmine's resolve. Denise's legacy wasn't just about the tragedy of her death. It was about the courage and compassion she had shown in her life. Jasmine decided that night that she would do everything in her power to ensure her mother's story continued to inspire change. The rally the next day was the largest yet. Thousands of people gathered in the park where the incident had occurred, holding candles and signs bearing Denise's name. Jasmine took the stage, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the microphone. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of strength. "My mother was a hero," Jasmine began, her voice clear and strong. "She gave her life to save a child, because that's who she was, someone who believed in protecting others, no matter the cost. But she shouldn't have had to die for doing the right thing." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the night. Jasmine continued, her words carrying the weight of her grief and determination. "This isn't just about my mom. This is about every life that's been lost because of hate and prejudice. It's about fixing a system that lets people like Richard Hale wear a badge and carry a gun. We have the power to make a change, and we owe it to my mom and to every other victim to fight for it." As Jasmine stepped down from the stage, the crowd's energy was electric. People chanted Denise's name, their voices rising together in a powerful show of solidarity. For the first time since her mother's death, Jasmine felt a glimmer of hope. The fight was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. Her mother's sacrifice would not be in vain. The momentum from the rally carried into the following weeks. Jasmine and Daniel found themselves swept up in a wave of activism that continued to grow. The story of Denise Caldwell, the Army colonel who had given her life to save a child, struck a chord with people across the nation. Her bravery, combined with the tragic injustice of her death, turned her name into a symbol of resistance against systemic racism and unchecked police brutality. But not everyone was on their side. For every supportive message they received, there was a hateful comment or a threatening email. Jasmine knew it came with the territory, but the vitriol still stung. Some people defended Richard Hale, painting him as a good cop who had made a mistake. Others attacked Denise herself, questioning her decisions and her character. One evening, as Jasmine scrolled through her phone, she came across a news segment featuring Hale's defense attorney. "Officer Hale deeply regrets the events that transpired," the lawyer said, his tone smooth and practiced. "But this was a split-second decision made under pressure. My client believed he was facing a threat. We ask for compassion as he appeals his sentence. Jasmine felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Compassion, she muttered under her breath. Where was his compassion when he shot my mother? Daniel, sitting nearby, looked up from his laptop. They're trying to twist the narrative, he said. Make it seem like Mom was the aggressor. We can't let them get away with it. Jasmine nodded, her jaw set with determination. Then, well, tell the truth louder, then they can lie. Their first step was to create a documentary about Denise's life. With the help of Maya Hernandez and a team of volunteers, they began gathering footage and interviews. They spoke with Denise's colleagues from the army, the children she had mentored, and the community members she had touched with her kindness and strength. One of the most powerful interviews came from Maria, the mother of the boy Denise had saved. Sitting in front of the camera, Maria recounted the moment Denise had rushed to help her son. I was screaming for help, and no one came, except her, Maria said, tears streaming down her face. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She just acted. And because of her, my son is alive. The documentary also delved into Hale's history, exposing the pattern of complaints and misconduct that had been ignored for years. It painted a damning picture of a system that had failed to hold him accountable, allowing his actions to escalate until they cost a life. As the documentary gained traction, Jasmine and Daniel began receiving invitations to speak at events and conferences. At first, Jasmine felt out of her depth. She wasn't a public speaker, and standing in front of a crowd made her stomach churn with nerves. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered her mother's unwavering courage. At one event, Jasmine stood before a packed auditorium, her hands trembling as she held the microphone. She took a deep breath and began to speak. My mom used to say that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Jasmine said. It means you do what's right even when you are. That's what she did every day of her life, and now it's my turn to be brave for her. The audience erupted into applause, their support bolstering Jasmine's confidence. She realized that her voice had power, and she was determined to use it, but the fight for justice wasn't without its setbacks. Hale's legal team launched an aggressive appeal, arguing that the media attention and public outcry had biased the jury. They demanded a retrial, and for a moment, it seemed as though Hale might escape justice altogether. The news hit Jasmine and Daniel like a punch to the gut. They're trying to rewrite the story, Daniel said, pacing back and forth in their living room. Act like Mom's life didn't matter. Jasmine clenched her fists, her eyes burning with unshed tears. We won't let them, she said, no matter what it takes. The day of the appeal hearing was tense and filled with uncertainty. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the streets. Inside, Jasmine and Daniel sat in the front row, their hearts pounding as the defense and prosecution presented their arguments. When the judge finally announced his decision, the courtroom fell silent. After reviewing the evidence and considering the arguments presented, the judge said, "This court denies the appeal. The original conviction and sentence will stand." Relief washed over Jasmine as the words sank in. Hale wouldn't walk free. But as she looked around the courtroom, she knew their work was far from over. This wasn't just about one cop or one case, it was about dismantling a system that allowed tragedies like this to happen in the first place. That night, Jasmine stood outside the courthouse, addressing a crowd of supporters. Today was a victory, she said, her voice ringing out over the cheers. But it's not the end. My mom gave her life to protect others, and now it's our turn to protect the next generation. Together, we can create a world where no one has to lose their life because of hate and ignorance. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers carrying a message of hope and determination. As Jasmine stepped down from the podium, Shifa, a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. Denise Caldwell's legacy would live on not just in their hearts, but in the change they were determined to create. The morning after the appeal, Jasmine woke up to a flood of notifications on her phone. The documentary about her mother, which they had released just days before, had gone viral overnight. Social media was buzzing with hashtags like Justice for Denise and Never Forget Her Sacrifice. Celebrities, politicians, and activists had shared the story, amplifying it to audiences around the world. Jasmine stared at the screen, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. "People are listening," she whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. Daniel walked into the room, holding 2 cups of coffee. He saw the expression on his sister's face and immediately knew something big had happened. "What's going on?" he asked, setting the cups down. Jasmine handed him her phone. "Look at this," she said. "It's everywhere." Daniel scrolled through the posts, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer scale of the response. "This is incredible," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "Mom's story is making a difference." The newfound attention brought opportunities they never could have imagined. A major news network invited Jasmine and Daniel to appear on a primetime segment to talk about their mother's legacy. Jasmine was nervous, but Daniel reassured her. "You've got this," he said, giving her hand a squeeze. "Just speak from the heart." When the camera started rolling, Jasmine took a deep breath and began to share her story. She talked about her mother's courage, the injustices they had faced, and their mission to create change. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, she found her strength. "My mother believed in a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect," Jasmine said, her eyes shining with emotion. She gave her life trying to make that world a reality. And now, it's up to us to finish what she started. The segment aired that night, and the response was overwhelming. Viewers from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own stories of loss and resilience. Donations poured into the foundation Jasmine and Daniel had started in their mother's honor, funding programs to support victims of police violence and promote diversity training for law enforcement. But not everyone was supportive. As their platform grew, so did the backlash. Jasmine began receiving hate mail and threats from people who resented their message. Some accused her of playing the race card or vilifying the police. The negativity weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let it deter her. One night, as she sorted through the mail, she came across a letter that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a retired police officer named Frank Morris. The handwriting was shaky, and the letter was brief, but it carried a powerful message. "I spent 30 years in the force," Frank wrote. "I saw things I wish I could forget. Your mother was a hero, and what happened to her was a tragedy. I'm sorry the system failed her. Keep fighting for change. It's long overdue." Jasmine held the letter close, tears streaming down her face. It was a reminder that their fight wasn't against all police officers, but against a broken system that allowed injustice to thrive. There were people on the inside who wanted change too, and their voices mattered just as much as hers. As the months passed, Jasmine and Daniel's work began to bear fruit. Their foundation partnered with lawmakers to push for reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training and greater accountability for police misconduct. They travel across the country, speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, spreading their message of hope and resilience. One of the most emotional moments came when they unveiled a memorial dedicated to Denise Caldwell. The monument, placed in the park where she had lost her life, featured a bronze statue of Denise holding a child in her arms. Beneath it, an inscription read, "In honor of Colonel Denise Caldwell, hero, a protector, a beacon of hope." At the unveiling ceremony, Jasmine and Daniel stood before a crowd of supporters, their hearts heavy with grief, but full of gratitude. Jasmine stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "This monument is not just for my mom," she said. "It's for every person who has fought for justice, who has stood up against hate, and who has believed in the power of love to overcome darkness. My mom's story doesn't end here, it lives on in all of us." The ceremony was a turning point, not just for Jasmine and Daniel, but for the entire community. People began to come together in ways they never had before, bridging divides and building connections. The tragedy of Denise Caldwell's death had sparked a movement, and it was transforming the world one step at a time. As Jasmine and Daniel walked away from the memorial that day, hand in hand, they felt a sense of peace they hadn't known in a long time. Their mother's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her legacy would endure, inspiring change and giving hope to those who needed it most. If you were moved by this story, please follow, like, and share to help spread its message. Together, we can make a difference.